the calm before the storm. As the calendar flips toward 2026, Venezuela, country once known for its vast oil wealth, stands on the edge of an unprecedented crisis. What was once a nation of potential has now become a cautionary tale for the world, teetering between economic collapse, social unrest, and political chaos. For months, whispers of strikes had been circulating. Oil workers, transport unions, and even key government officials hinting at a massive, coordinated shutdown. At first, these were just murmurs, minor disruptions here and there, but now intelligence reports and eyewitness accounts suggest something far more serious is unfolding. If these strikes reach their full potential, analysts warn, the consequences could ripple far beyond Venezuela's borders, shaking global energy markets, destabilizing neighboring economies, and even threatening international security. For ordinary Venezuelans, the reality is grim. Power outages are becoming routine, food shortages are intensifying, and the currency, already teetering on the brink, shows no sign of recovery. Yet amid this turmoil, the strikes are not just an economic maneuver. They are a direct challenge to the Maduro administration. Oil, which accounts for roughly 95% of Venezuela's export revenue, is both the lifeline of the government and the target of these workers' fury. The stakes could not be higher. A complete halt in production could cripple the state's ability to function, igniting protests and perhaps even triggering a collapse reminiscent of the 2019 economic implosion. But this time, the world is watching more closely. Internationally, the situation is generating anxiety in oil markets. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and even a partial shutdown sends shockwaves through global energy prices. Traders in New York, London, and Singapore are monitoring every report from Caracas, aware that a prolonged disruption could tighten already strained supplies and push crude prices sharply upward. Beyond economics, there's a geopolitical dimension. The United States, already wary of instability in Latin America, is signaling that it could intervene diplomatically or otherwise if the strikes escalate into full-scale chaos. China and Russia, key allies and investors in Venezuelan infrastructure, are also assessing their exposure. In short, a localized labor dispute in Caracas has the potential to spiral into a global crisis. But to truly understand the magnitude of what's happening, one must look beyond numbers and oil rigs. Venezuela is a nation scarred by years of mismanagement, corruption, and authoritarian governance. Hospitals lack basic medicine, schools struggle to operate, and immigration has stripped the country of millions of young professionals. The strikes, then, are not occurring in a vacuum. They are a catalyst in a tinderbox of social, economic, and political pressures. Analysts warn that the first few days of a national shutdown could set off a chain reaction. Food riots, mass migrations, and even violence in oil-producing regions like Zulia and Monagas. On the ground, there are signs of mounting tension. Workers in the ports of Puerto La Cruz and Amway have begun organizing in secret, coordinating schedules and communication channels to maximize disruption. Social media, despite government censorship, has become a vital tool for strike leaders, spreading instructions and building momentum. Meanwhile, the Maduro administration is scrambling to maintain control, deploying security forces to key oil facilities and attempting to negotiate with labor unions. But trust has eroded over years, and few believe that mere promises will be enough to prevent escalation. Observers outside Venezuela are asking the same question. Could this strike trigger a complete collapse of the Venezuelan state? The answer, experts say, depends on timing and coordination. A single day of halted production would be disruptive. A week could be catastrophic. If strikes align with other vulnerabilities such as low food stocks, dwindling foreign reserves, public discontent, the country could descend into chaos faster than anyone anticipates. Moreover, the crisis could have a domino effect. Neighboring Colombia, Brazil, and even the Caribbean islands could face sudden waves of refugees, economic disruption, and instability. Global markets, already jittery from other 2026 pressures, may react with panic, creating a perfect storm that goes far beyond Caracas. Yet, for all the danger, there's an eerie calm in the streets. Venezuelans have learned resilience through decades of crisis. Markets still function in informal ways. Families find ways to survive, and community networks provide support where the state cannot. This calm, however, may be deceiving. As one senior analyst notes, Venezuela doesn't explode slowly, it reaches a tipping point. When it does, the consequences are immediate and devastating. With tensions mounting, the strikes represent more than labor unrest. They are a test of whether the government can survive a direct challenge to its lifeblood, the oil industry, or whether a deeper collapse is inevitable. The international community, meanwhile, is caught in a delicate balancing act. Sanctions and economic measures, long used as tools of influence, now risk exacerbating the very problems they aim to solve. Humanitarian organizations are preparing for emergency relief, but access is limited, and distribution is fraught with logistical and political challenges. Meanwhile, global investors are adjusting their portfolios. Wary of potential shocks in commodity markets and regional instability, some are quietly preparing for worst-case scenarios, including disruptions that could last weeks or months. As night falls over Caracas, the signs of tension are everywhere. Convoys of trucks transporting essential supplies move under heavy security. Oil tankers sit idle at ports, and messages circulate on encrypted apps, warning citizens to prepare for shortages. Analysts warn that the next few days could define Venezuela's trajectory for years to come. Will the strikes force meaningful change, or will they accelerate a collapse that has long been predicted? One thing is certain: the world cannot afford to look away. The 2026 crisis is not just a Venezuelan problem, it is a global one, and the clock is ticking. The strike unfolds, and the domino effect. As dawn breaks over Venezuela, the first signs of the strike's full force become undeniable. Ports that once hummed with activity now sit eerily silent. Cranes stand still, oil tankers remain moored, and pipelines, the veins of the nation's lifeblood, pulse with inactivity. Workers across the oil sector, emboldened by months of clandestine organization, are following through on threats that few outsiders initially took seriously. The impact is immediate. Domestic fuel shortages begin to appear in major cities. Public transportation slows to a crawl, and the black market, already a lifeline for many Venezuelans, starts to see frantic surges in demand. Yet, even amid this chaos, the government's public statements paint a different picture, claiming that operations continue as normal. Observers know better. Reality on the ground tells a far more ominous story. The first 48 hours of the strike reveal vulnerabilities that experts had long predicted. Venezuela's dependence on oil revenue, which constitutes the backbone of its economy, exposes every weakness accumulated over decades of mismanagement. Banks face technical failures as payment systems tied to oil exports falter. Hospitals, already struggling, begin to experience intermittent electricity outages, making the care of patients increasingly precarious. Food distribution networks reliant on fuel for transportation start to falter, leaving urban centers especially vulnerable. Ordinary citizens, who have grown accustomed to scarcity, now face an unprecedented convergence of crisis, food, medicine, and electricity simultaneously. For many, panic is tempered by grim experience, but the tension is palpable. As the strike escalates, regional instability begins to manifest. Colombia, sharing a long, porous border with Venezuela, observes a steady increase in migrants seeking refuge. Some cross illegally, while others attempt to register at official checkpoints, overwhelming local authorities. Brazil's northern states, historically insulated from Venezuela's internal crises, now see the first signs of economic reverberation. Price spikes on imported Venezuelan goods and disruptions in supply chains for agricultural products. Caribbean nations, heavily dependent on Venezuelan fuel, begin emergency preparations, fearing widespread shortages. Analysts warn that these early signals foreshadow a more systemic breakdown if the strike persists. In short, what began as a labor dispute is rapidly evolving into a geopolitical dilemma. Inside Venezuela, the Maduro administration struggles to maintain control. Security forces are deployed around key oil facilities, but their presence only escalates tension. Workers, anticipating government intervention, organize defensive strategies, including rotating shifts and encrypted communications. Reports emerge of confrontations in Maracaibo and Punto Fio, where small skirmishes between security personnel and striking workers have already resulted in casualties. Yet the government continues to downplay the severity. Projecting an image of authority while behind closed doors, ministers scrambled to devise contingency plans. Advisors warned that even a partial collapse of oil output could have cascading effects on state revenue, international debt obligations, and essential imports. The stakes are clear. Failure to resolve the strike quickly could irreparably damage Venezuela's fragile stability. Global markets, attuned to every ripple, respond almost immediately. Crude prices, already under pressure from other 2026 economic factors, spike sharply. Traders in New York, London, and Shanghai react to breaking news reports, while analysts scramble to quantify the impact of Venezuela's halted production. Hedge funds and investment firms, anticipating prolonged disruption, begin moving capital into gold and other safe haven assets, signaling a lack of confidence in near-term recovery. Meanwhile, nations dependent on Venezuelan oil, including the United States and several European countries, initiate emergency measures to diversify supply. Drawing from strategic reserves and alternative partners, the world is watching, and the message is clear. Venezuela's internal crisis is no longer contained within its borders. The human dimension of the strike intensifies. Fuel queues stretch for miles, with families spending hours, sometimes days, just to secure a small amount of gasoline. Urban transportation grinds to a halt, forcing citizens to walk long distances or rely on increasingly scarce buses. Hospitals ration care, prioritizing emergency cases over routine procedures. Food prices surge in markets and shops, prompting protests and occasional outbreaks of violence. Social media, while heavily monitored and censored, becomes a lifeline for citizens sharing real-time information, including rationing strategies, reports of unrest, and warnings about unsafe areas. For many Venezuelans, survival now depends not on the state, but on adaptability, resourcefulness, and community networks. The geopolitical implications deepen as well. The United States, closely monitoring developments, issues statements calling for restraint while simultaneously signaling that it is prepared to act if the crisis escalates further. China and Russia, which have invested heavily in Venezuelan infrastructure and oil production, assess their options, wary of both economic losses and reputational damage. Regional organizations, including the Organization of American States, debate emergency responses, but political divisions and ideological differences hinder unified action. In short, Venezuela's domestic upheaval is now intertwined with global strategy, creating a tense standoff that could easily spiral into confrontation if mismanaged. Within the strike movement itself, coordination remains surprisingly sophisticated. Union leaders, many of whom have spent years navigating Venezuela's volatile political environment, use a combination of digital communication and traditional networks to maintain unity. They rotate shifts to keep pressure on the government while minimizing exposure to direct retaliation. Leaders issue statements emphasizing that the strike is both a protest and a demand for systemic change, not simply a labor dispute. This framing is crucial, transforms the strike from a short-term disruption into a potential catalyst for profound political and social change. Yet even as the strike demonstrates remarkable coordination, cracks begin to appear. Some regions, especially those less reliant on central planning, continue operations, creating tension between local authorities and striking groups. Discrepancies in enforcement threaten to weaken the movement's overall impact, providing the Maduro administration with openings to negotiate or exploit divisions. Analysts note that the longer the strike persists, the more the balance of power will shift, not only between government and labor, but within the complex web of political factions, military interests, and international actors. Timing, as always, becomes everything. Collapse accelerates, and the global fallout. By the third day of the strike, Venezuela is no longer just a country in crisis. It is a flashpoint on the brink of total collapse. The once steady hum of oil rigs has become an ominous silence, echoing through empty ports and idle refineries. Trucks meant to transport fuel sit abandoned on highways, while queues of desperate citizens stretch for miles, waiting for dwindling reserves that may never arrive. Hospitals operate on minimal power, and shortages of food, medicine, and essential supplies have become critical. The impact of the strikes is no longer theoretical. It is a daily reality, one that threatens not only Venezuela's economy, but the very fabric of society itself. Inside Caracas, panic mixes with resilience. Neighborhoods organize informal defense networks to protect supplies and maintain order, while local leaders attempt to coordinate rationing systems for food and fuel. Yet the strain is immense. Reports of theft, clashes over scarce resources, and spontaneous protests have surged, signaling that social cohesion is beginning to fray. For ordinary Venezuelans, the crisis is existential. Every day brings uncertainty about whether there will be electricity to cook, fuel to commute, or food to eat. The psychological toll is profound, with fear and frustration palpable on the streets. The government's attempts to restore control are faltering. Security forces, stretched thin and facing widespread defiance, struggle to maintain authority. The Maduro administration calls for dialogue and compromise, yet many union leaders and workers distrust these promises, seeing them as tactics to weaken the strike. In oil regions like Zulia, strikes are absolute, with no production occurring. In Caracas, key infrastructure faces intermittent sabotage, whether intentional or accidental, further straining government response. Analysts warn that the government's legitimacy is increasingly questioned, both domestically and internationally, as the strikes expose vulnerabilities to long ignored. Global markets are reacting violently. Oil prices have surged to levels unseen in years, sparking volatility that reverberates from Wall Street to Shanghai. Countries dependent on Venezuelan energy scramble to secure alternative supplies, driving up global demand for crude from other sources. Investors flee risky assets, favoring gold and other safe havens, while emerging markets feel the pressure from sudden spikes in energy costs. In many ways, Venezuela has become the epicenter of a global economic tremor, reminder that interconnected markets leave no nation immune to internal crises. Neighboring countries, particularly Colombia and Brazil, are bracing for consequences beyond energy. Refugee flows have intensified, with thousands crossing borders daily. Local governments struggle to provide shelter, healthcare, and security, while social tensions grow as communities contend with sudden population surges. Humanitarian organizations, though present, face logistical and political hurdles, hampered by lack of funding, coordination, and access. The region is witnessing the first signs of a cascading crisis, one that could easily extend throughout South America if the Venezuelan strikes continue. Meanwhile, international powers are weighing responses. The United States issues stern warnings, emphasizing the need for stability and threatening potential sanctions if the situation worsens. China and Russia, with major investments and long-standing partnerships in Venezuela, watch closely, attempting to protect their economic interests while avoiding public involvement. Regional organizations debate emergency measures, but political divisions prevent a unified approach. As a result, Venezuela teeters on the edge, caught between internal turmoil and external pressure. With little room for compromise, amid this chaos, the strike movement itself begins to evolve. Leaders recognize that their actions carry enormous consequences, and they shift strategy from merely halting production to using leverage for political negotiation. They demand structural reforms, accountability, and guarantees for labor rights issues that extend far beyond oil. At the same time, they carefully manage public perception, highlighting that their struggle is not against ordinary citizens, but against systemic corruption and mismanagement. In essence, the strike becomes both a weapon and a statement, a challenge to decades of failed governance. By the fourth day, the consequences are unmistakable. Venezuela's economy has effectively ground to a halt. Currency values have plunged further, inflation has spiked uncontrollably, and basic imports have been disrupted. Energy blackouts spread to regions previously untouched, compounding the humanitarian crisis. International media report daily on the worsening situation, portraying Venezuela as a nation unraveling before the world. Analysts warn that if the strike continues, the country could face total collapse, potentially resembling a failed state scenario with profound implications for the region and beyond. Despite the chaos, the story of Venezuela is also one of resilience. Citizens adapt, forming community networks to share resources, protect neighborhoods, and maintain some semblance of order. Volunteer initiatives provide emergency aid, informal markets supply essential goods, and citizens rely on ingenuity and solidarity to survive. However, these measures can only mitigate immediate suffering. They cannot replace systemic stability, which remains elusive as long as the strike paralyzes the nation. The strike also underscores a crucial lesson for the world: the fragility of nations dependent on single industries. Venezuela's reliance on oil revenue has left it vulnerable to shocks, demonstrating how a targeted disruption can trigger social, economic, and geopolitical crises simultaneously. Global observers take note: this is a situation that demands attention, preparation, and understanding, as its consequences may reach far beyond what many imagine. Thank you for watching this in-depth exploration. If you found this video informative and want to stay updated on hidden stories shaping our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Hidden History Vault. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a critical update. The story of Venezuela is still unfolding and will continue to bring you every twist, every development, and every revelation that the mainstream media may overlook.